These are just some of the regions in the world that today have secessionist or independence movements. Experts count from 60 to more than 100 existing cases today. These movements arise mainly for tribal, ethnic, and religious reasons. For reasons of marginalization and violent repression. And also for political reasons, of a nationalist nature, and even merely for economic reasons. We find cases of irredentism, which are regions with the aspiration of integrating into a territory that is in another state. Mainly due to cultural similarities, such as the Srpska Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where a large part of the population defends accession to Serbia, or South Tyrol in Italy to join Austria, or Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom to join Ireland. We also find cases of de facto countries, that is, territories that, although they are under the sovereignty of a country, in practice exist as an independent nation, such as the cases of Transnistria in Moldova. Abkhazia in Georgia, Northern Cyprus in Cyprus, or Somaliland in Somalia. Finally, the most common, cases of independence by secession, whose intention is to form a new independent state, such as Scotland in the United Kingdom, Basque Country in Spain, Flanders in Belgium, Texas in the United States, Baja California in Mexico, Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, or Bali in Indonesia. In Africa we find the most violent and repressive active cases. This is the case of Ambazonia in Cameroon, or Western Togoland in the Republic of Ghana. In advanced democracies we find examples of peaceful cases, whose claims are mainly based on reasons of economic distribution and the promotion of nationalist policies that generate friction between both parties. The United Nations and international jurisprudence indicate that a region or a people will have the right to self-determination when it is a region under a colonial regime, in the case of a town or region subjected by force and military repression, or in the case of a people, within a state, with very different ethnic, historical, religious and cultural conditions, and the state does not respect and violates these conditions. In this case, the concept of people is not very well defined, diffuse and controversial. The vast majority of independence movements, especially in high and middle-income countries, do not meet these conditions. But in addition to this, no state in the world directly and unconditionally contemplates the right to self-determination in its laws, understanding the state as indivisible and inalienable in its constitutions. Not even the states with the highest rates of freedom. It was only contemplated by the former Soviet Union in favor of the different republics that made it up. And by the way, none did, since all attempts were quickly put down by the Soviet government, alleging nationalist motivations. Regarding the exceptional case of Quebec in Canada, when we delve deeper we find a complicated legislative framework with certain diffuse and inconsistent points among themselves that do not make clear the real and final possibility of self-determination for the province of Quebec. Although, it is summarized in that Quebec, in 1980, requested a referendum asking its population for permission to negotiate an ambiguous form of independence. The no won with 60% of votes. In 1995, Quebec tried again, also not being a pure secession consultation. The no also won, but with a narrow margin of votes. Today, in 2022, there is hardly any talk of independence in Quebec, and the movement no longer has political force. In relation to the cases of Scotland and Wales in the United Kingdom, it must be taken into account that they are formerly independent nations that were annexed to England more than 300 and 500 years ago respectively, even by mutual agreement, as is the case of Scotland in 1707. Since then, no referendum had been considered, until 300 years later, in 2014, when an agreement was established between the governments of Scotland and the United Kingdom to hold a referendum. Finally, the no was imposed with 55% of the votes. In November 2022, referendum petitions were promoted again from Wales and Scotland, but were denied by the UK Supreme Court. Not even states like Switzerland, with a strong liberal character, libertarian in the United States, contemplate self-determination without the support of all affected Swiss cantons. In some countries, such as Germany, political parties whose claim is to divide the state are directly prohibited. It's nice to think that all peoples should be able to determine themselves if they wish. Each province, each city, each neighborhood, and even reaching each individual as an independent agent in itself. Although for this to happen we would have to live in total and global anarchy. And this is utopian. The harsh reality, and everything that surrounds it, shows us that in most cases unilateral self-determination is not possible. That there are not only geographical barriers. There are more barriers. Some politics and geopolitics, cultural barriers, legal barriers, historical barriers, territorial barriers, emotional barriers, economic barriers, sometimes even violence and pain. Despite this, we have a few cases in recent history, since the 1990s, in which a region within a state has managed to acquire its independence. Most of them ended up being involved in armed conflicts, prior nor subsequent, as is the case in South Sudan, Kosovo, East Timor, Croatia, Eritrea, Baltic republics, republics of the Caucasus, Bosnian, Slovenia, Moldova, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Namibia. In fact, South Sudan, more than a decade after gaining its independence, since 2011, is still immersed in a bloody civil war that has already accumulated more than 400,000 deaths. We have the case of the former republics of the USSR, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. with peaceful independence processes when the USSR dissolved. Although for obvious reasons, 30 years later we cannot say that they have done well. Belarus and Kazakhstan are totalitarian dictatorships at the service of Russia. And the Ukraine, by distancing itself, has ended up being invaded and totally destroyed by Russia. Other cases like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Macedonia. Independent since 1991, they have hardly grown in nominal terms and continue to be among the poorest countries on the planet. We found only 2 cases that we can say have been successful independents, at least in relative terms. Although they are 2 microstates, and which also started from being among the poorest countries on the planet. The first, Palau, with barely 20,000 inhabitants, independent since 1994. It has had a GDP growth of almost 100% in the last 20 years, going from being a poor country to being in an intermediate development area with about $10,000 of GDP per capita. The second, Montenegro, with barely 600,000 inhabitants, independent since 2006. It has had a GDP growth of more than 200% since 2006, although it had already been growing in those terms years before its independence. Going from being a poor country to being in an intermediate development area with about $8,000 of GDP per capita. Once the situation and data have been reviewed, dilemmas and questions arise. But there are very obvious cases. Cases of exploited colonies. Cases of regions subjected to a superior military yoke. Cases in which the human rights of these people are therefore being violated, and there is no doubt that not only do they have the right to secede, but the United Nations should give them the necessary help and support to do so. And there are other cases, even in advanced and high-income democracies, based on political motives, nationalistic in nature and even purely for fiscal or economic reasons. In these cases is where the dilemmas and questions really arise. Although there are legal and other barriers that make it impossible, we understand that, at least philosophically, any people should be able to self-determine. But is this always possible? And is it objectively the best option? In the first place, who determines what is a people? That is, who or what determines who or what is the subject with the power to decide? And because, in the event of holding a referendum, what should be the minimum percentage of votes that can be assumed to guarantee such an important irrevocable decision? If the no wins the referendum, should it be possible to ask it again in the future? If so, how many years must pass before another referendum can be held again? And because, in case the yes win, could a subdivision of the new seceded territory request its own referendum to become independent from it, or even to become part of the previous state again? If not, why not? We are talking about creating a new state from scratch that already started from a high income level. We are not talking about a poor country with 100% growth potential. On the other hand, we are talking about an irrevocable decision in principle, with vital significance, not only for oneself but for future generations. With unpredictable political, social and economic implications that, according to any probability factor, will be harmful or very harmful for the new nascent state, at least in the first 3 or 4 decades. Administrative inefficiency, loss of trust, legal insecurity, flight of people, flight of companies, flight of capital, lack of financing, accumulation of debt, are just some of the predictable immediate consequences. Who guarantees that citizens are going to make such a decision with all the necessary information? Knowing and objectively weighing all the real risks and all possible negative consequences. Assuming the probable decline of the next decades. Furthermore, in cases of advanced democracies with high incomes, would citizens really see their lives improved if they voted yes? In what way and why? And have citizens wondered what the advantages would be and to what extent it would improve their lives enough to assume such risks and negative consequences? How do we know that from the power of the institutions and from the power of the media, and outside of common sense and objectivity, populist techniques or any other political technique are not being applied to drag the masses? Remember, there will be no going back. Is it worth risking so much? And in the end, for what?